The Department of Interior today announced an emergency plan for Colorado River drought management, and it could send levels at Lake Mead spiraling downwards.
Lake Mead is the biggest reservoir in America, giving water to 40 million people across 7 states. Most visitors see a calm blue lake in the Nevada desert and think nothing of it. But as a 20-year drought slowly drained the water away, what appeared along the shoreline left investigators stunned. Bodies in barrels, a World War II aircraft, and an entire town swallowed by the lake decades ago. The water had been hiding all of it. So what else is still down there? Join us as we explore what divers found as Lake Mead dried up, and tell us in the comments whether you think the lake has given up all its secrets or if the darkest ones are still sitting at the bottom.
A dam of this size had never been built. It was enormous. Many people said it was impossible. It would never happen.
Terrifying things divers found at Lake Mead. The most disturbing thing divers and investigators have pulled from Lake Mead in recent years is not a sunken vehicle or an old piece of marina equipment. It is a human body stuffed inside a rusted 50-gallon metal barrel sitting in the mud near Hemingway Harbor after decades underwater. In May of 2022, boaters spotted the barrel along a stretch of newly exposed shoreline that had been completely submerged for years before drought conditions dropped the lake to historic lows. When investigators opened the barrel, they found skeletal remains, along with clothing and personal items that suggested the person had died sometime between the mid-1970s and the early 1980s. Examination of the body indicated the individual had been shot before being placed inside the drum. Nobody had seen that barrel or its contents for roughly 40 years. Lake Mead had kept that secret buried beneath hundreds of feet of water for decades before the drought finally gave it back. That discovery was only the beginning of what started appearing once the water began retreating. So stay with us. Within days of the barrel find, a second empty barrel surfaced nearby. Then investigators began locating human remains scattered across different sections of the lake's newly exposed shoreline. By the end of 2022, at least 6 separate sets of human remains had been recovered from Lake Mead or its receding waterline. Skeletal remains turned up at Swim Beach, at Colville Bay, and along exposed mudflats in areas that had been deep underwater for years. Some sets of remains were quickly connected to missing persons cases that had gone cold for decades. One set of bones found near Colville Bay in October 2022 was eventually linked to a man who had disappeared from that very area nearly 50 years earlier. His wallet, credit cards, and jeans were recovered alongside the remains. An entire half-century had passed while the lake quietly held onto that evidence. The cold, dark water had preserved details that might have otherwise been lost forever. Yet human remains were not the only disturbing presence beneath the surface. National Park Service officials revealed that there are hundreds of metal barrels resting in the deeper sections of Lake Mead, some of them dating all the way back to the construction of Hoover Dam in the 1930s. The number surprised even experienced investigators who had spent years studying the lake. No one had ever conducted a full accounting of what the reservoir was holding in its darker, more remote underwater regions, partly because the lake is simply too large and too dangerous to search comprehensively. Cleanup crews and divers have described encountering entire fields of corroded drums lying across the lake floor in regions where visibility disappears quickly and the terrain becomes impossible to navigate without specialized equipment. Some barrels are half swallowed by decades of settled sediment. Others rest against underwater rock formations as though they rolled there slowly over time. Nobody can always say with certainty what each one originally contained. Some are believed to hold construction waste from the dam building era, while others raise far more troubling questions. The sheer number of barrels scattered across separate underwater zones is what unsettles investigators most. Each one is a sealed container holding whatever was placed inside it before the water rose to cover it permanently. And that's not all. Sunken boats have added another layer to the Lake Mead underwater inventory. A World War II-era Higgins landing craft, the type of vessel used to carry troops onto beaches during combat operations, spent decades sitting nearly 200 feet below the surface near the Lake Mead Marina before dropping water levels began exposing its ribbed wooden frame. As the waterline fell, the craft rose into shallower water until its skeletal structure eventually broke the surface, jutting out of the lake like the remains of something much larger. Divers who explored it before water levels changed described reaching the wreckage through dark, cold water and finding the hull still largely intact despite decades of submersion. The craft had been stripped of its engine at some point, but its armored plating remained partially intact, preserved by the lake's cold, sediment-rich depths in ways that defied expectation. Deeper down, an even more extraordinary aircraft waited silently on the lake floor. In July of 1948, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress bomber on a post-war research mission crashed into Lake Mead after its crew misjudged the altitude above the glassy, mirror-flat surface of the water. The lake's surface that morning offered no visible depth cues, and the plane skipped hard across the water before 3 of its 4 engines tore away on impact. All 5 crew members escaped the crash alive, but the aircraft sank approximately 260 feet to the bottom, where it remained undiscovered for more than 50 years. When recreational divers finally located the wreck in the early 2000s after water levels had dropped enough to bring it within reachable depth, they found the plane remarkably preserved. The cockpit still contained a parachute stretched between the seats, left behind during the frantic crew evacuation. Colonies of invasive mussels had colonized the aircraft's aluminum body, forming a strange living blanket across the old bomber. Today, access to the B-29 is strictly controlled and requires a guided dive, as the National Park Service works to protect the historic wreck from damage. Alongside aircraft and barrels, divers exploring the Lake Mead's floor have recovered submerged vehicles, anchors, dock hardware, and recreational equipment lost during decades of heavy tourist activity. Areas near popular marinas have produced tangled masses of fishing line, hooks, and abandoned nets wrapped around underwater rock formations. Lost personal belongings scattered across shallower sections of the lake floor include sunglasses, phones, jewelry, and other items dropped by the millions of visitors who have used Lake Mead for swimming, boating, and recreation over the years. Divers have also located weapons in sections of the lake near older shoreline access points, though authorities have noted that not all of those weapons have been connected to known criminal cases. Perhaps the strangest discovery of all is not an object but an entire town. The settlement of St. Thomas, Nevada was founded in 1865 by Mormon pioneers along the Colorado River. At its peak, the town held around 2,000 residents, a post office, and a small community infrastructure built to last generations. When construction of Hoover Dam began and the rising waters of Lake Mead started filling the basin, the residents of St. Thomas received notice that their homes would eventually disappear beneath the water. They held on as long as possible. By June of 1938, the last residents waded out of their flooded streets and the post office closed for good. Lake Mead swallowed the entire town and kept it submerged for decades. When drought conditions caused the water to retreat enough in the early 2000s, the ruins of St. Thomas reappeared along the exposed lake bed. Building foundations, chimneys, and crumbled walls have all resurfaced since then, giving visitors a rare look at a settlement the lake buried before most living Americans were born. And that's only the beginning of the story surrounding Lake Mead, because as you're about to discover, this massive reservoir is filled with far more secrets, strange discoveries, and fascinating facts than most people could ever imagine. So stay with us. Other mind-blowing details about Lake Mead. Most people treat Lake Mead the way they treat any large body of water near a major city. A backdrop for vacation photographs, a place to rent a boat for the afternoon, somewhere to take a family during summer heat while the casinos cool down behind them. What those visitors rarely consider is how unusual Lake Mead actually is, or how much of what surrounds them exists because of forces far more powerful than any resort development plan. Lake Mead is not simply a large reservoir sitting conveniently near Las Vegas. It is the largest reservoir in the United States, holding more water than any other man-made lake in the country when it operates at full capacity. That distinction carries weight far beyond tourism statistics or recreation numbers. The lake straddles the border between Nevada and Arizona, spreading across roughly 247 square miles of desert terrain that the Colorado River once carved through over millions of years. It was the construction of Hoover Dam during the 1930s that created the lake, backing up the Colorado River behind one of the most ambitious engineering projects in American history. At full capacity, Lake Mead stretches about 112 miles long with 759 miles of shoreline wrapping around its irregular desert edges. Driving the full circumference of the lake requires hours of navigation through winding canyon roads and remote desert stretches where cell service disappears entirely and the terrain looks almost exactly the way it must have looked before any dam existed. At its deepest point, the lake reaches down approximately 500 feet, dropping into sections of the old Colorado River Canyon that have never seen daylight since the water rose to cover them. And here comes something nobody will ever tell you. Lake Mead supplies drinking water to more than 25 million people across Nevada, Arizona, California, and parts of New Mexico. That staggering number includes the residents of Las Vegas, one of the fastest-growing cities in the American West, along with agricultural communities and rural populations spread across an enormous region of the country. The water itself travels through an elaborate system of intake pipes, pumping stations, and treatment facilities before reaching homes and businesses. When drought conditions pushed the lake low enough in 2022 to expose the uppermost intake pipe on April 25th of that year, water managers were forced to switch immediately to a deeper emergency intake that had been completed just 2 years earlier in preparation for exactly that scenario. The fact that engineers had already anticipated the intake failure speaks to how closely officials had been monitoring the lake's decline for years. That decline is part of a much larger story about the American Southwest. A mega drought gripping the region for more than 2 decades has steadily reduced the water flowing into Lake Mead from the Colorado River and its tributaries. By the summer of 2022, the lake had dropped to around 27% of its total capacity, reaching levels not seen since the reservoir first filled in the late 1930s. The so-called bathtub ring, a pale white mineral band left on canyon walls where the water once reached, climbed more than 180 feet above the lake's surface during the worst periods of the drought. That visible scar on the surrounding rock became one of the most widely photographed signs of a water crisis affecting millions of people across multiple states. Scientists monitoring the situation have warned that without significant changes in water consumption and consistent snowpack in the Rocky Mountains, the lake could continue dropping toward levels that would threaten the region's water security entirely. The geological history underneath Lake Mead adds another dimension to what makes this body of water so unusual. The bedrock beneath the lake basin includes some of the oldest exposed rock in the American Southwest, with certain formations dating back more than 1 billion years. The Colorado River spent millions of years carving through layers of sandstone, limestone, and older geological material before Hoover Dam stopped its flow and the lake began filling in the 1930s. Volcanic activity shaped significant portions of the surrounding landscape, leaving black basalt formations and ancient lava flows visible along canyon walls near areas like Fortification Hill and Colville Mesa. When drought conditions dropped the lake and exposed sedimentary rock layers along the shoreline that had not been visible since the 1930s, geologists discovered that some of those layers contained volcanic ash particles that had traveled hundreds of miles from eruptions in Idaho, Wyoming, and California as many as 12 million years ago. The lake had been sitting on geological evidence of ancient volcanic events for almost a century without anyone realizing it. But with all of that said, have you ever wondered how this massive lake came into existence in the first place? Well, the story behind its creation is just as fascinating as the mysteries hidden beneath its surface.
It was a conquest, it was a controlling of nature.
Nothing like it had been achieved before, and many thought it couldn't be done.
It was a bold idea on a scale that truly had not been seen in dam construction before.
The shocking history surrounding Lake Mead. The story of Lake Mead begins not with water but with concrete and with death. In the early 20th century, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation devised plans for a massive dam on the Arizona-Nevada border to tame the Colorado River and provide water and hydroelectric power to the developing Southwest. Colorado had been flooding and destroying communities for decades. Farmers and city planners in Nevada, Arizona, and California needed the river controlled. Congress approved the project in 1928, and construction began in 1931, in the middle of the Great Depression and one of the most hostile environments in America. The crew bored into carbon monoxide-choked tunnels and dangled from heights of 800 feet to clear canyon walls. In the summer of 1931, the average daytime high at the dam site was 119.9 degrees Fahrenheit. 16 workers died from heat stroke that summer alone. There was no shade, no adequate medical care, and no legal obligation from the contractor to protect workers from the gases building up inside the tunnels they were drilling. The Bureau of Reclamation's official industrial fatality count is 96 workers, representing deaths directly attributable to on-site accidents. Men crushed by equipment, killed in falls from canyon walls, drowned, struck by debris. But that number has never told the full story. At least 46 additional workers were reported to have died from work-related conditions like carbon monoxide poisoning. The contractor classified many of those deaths as pneumonia rather than poisoning, a classification that conveniently excluded them from the official industrial fatality count and reduced the contractor's legal liability. Historians have disputed that accounting ever since. The true number of people who died building the dam that created Lake Mead may never be known. The eerie coincidence that defines the construction's human cost involves the Tierney family. The first worker to die was John Gregory Tierney, a surveyor who drowned in the Colorado River on December 20th, 1922. The last recorded death was his son, Patrick Tierney, who died exactly 13 years later on December 20th, 1935, during the final stages of construction. Father and son, 13 years apart to the day, both killed by the same project. The memorial plaque at the dam lists 96 names. It does not list the 42 men whose deaths were reclassified. It does not list the workers who died of heat in their first summer.
You can imagine for the laborers who built the Hoover Dam in a remote site to see this gargantuan project in concrete rising up from the canyon floor. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before.
And it does not list John Tierney, whose death preceded official construction by nearly a decade, but whose surveying work made the entire project possible. And this is where it really gets better. Approximately 5 million barrels of cement and 45 million pounds of reinforcement steel went into what was then the tallest dam in the world. Its 6.6 million tons of concrete were enough to pave a road from San Francisco to New York City. Altogether, some 21,000 workers contributed to its construction. When the final block of concrete was poured and President Franklin Roosevelt dedicated the structure on September 30th, 1935, a crowd of 20,000 people gathered to watch. The Colorado River, which had been one of the most unpredictable and destructive forces in the American West, was contained. And behind the dam, the water began to rise. As Lake Mead filled for the first time between 1935 and 1941, the massive weight of the rising water put pressure on faults in the earth beneath the reservoir. More than 600 small earthquakes were recorded during this period. In 1939, a 5.0 magnitude earthquake struck the area, the largest triggered by the filling of the lake. Nobody had fully anticipated that creating the largest reservoir in the country would also mean creating a new seismic zone directly above it. The engineers who designed the dam had solved the problem of the river. They had created a different problem beneath the lake. By 1938, the rising water had consumed everything in the valley below the dam, including the town of St. Thomas, Nevada, where the last resident waded out of the flooded streets in June of that year, and the post office closed its doors for the last time. The people left. The buildings did not. The lake kept rising, and beneath its surface, in the cold and the dark and the sediment, the history of everything that had been placed there, voluntarily or otherwise, settled into the quiet the water provided. That quiet lasted for decades. It was known by everyone, but the mob knew it. Even the dam builders knew it. The lake kept every secret placed inside it, every barrel, every body, every aircraft, every town, every bone, sealed beneath hundreds of feet of cold, dark water. Then the drought came, and what 70 years of silence had protected the retreating water began, slowly and without warning, to return. So let's discuss in the comments below. Which discovery shocked you the most? What other mysteries do you think Lake Mead is still hiding? Like, share, and subscribe. And click the next video on your screen. You will enjoy it.